This is a series about typography called The Grand Design. Part 1 deals with the anatomy of type. So what is typography? It's the arrangement and specification of letters to communicate. Robert Bringhurst says that typography exists to honor the content. And Paul Rand says good typography is art. Type is the cornerstone of literacy. It's used to communicate, it's used to understand, and it's very important. The full font in a typeface is more than 26 letters. As you can see, there are many characters that have been designed to ease our readability and communication. Although we now widely use typography digitally, the rich history of typography is very physical. Over our history, in order to communicate, humans have used sharp objects to carve into mud, clay, and marble. We've dipped pens in ink and physically put ink on paper. We've created cursive handwriting and then moved into casting type with a machine called a letterpress with molten lead. And as you'll notice, typefaces look different from each other. What's that all about? Why is it important? How can we use this information and knowledge to design better communication pieces? Type is a tool used for communication. Historically, the letter forms in a typeface often reflect the tool that was used to produce the type. And the physical properties of each letter form historically reflected the tool used to develop and produce the type. It should also be a reflection of the content that's intended to be communicated. Although today we widely use digital typography, especially in the design of our elements of communication, it's important to remember that typefaces have particular uses, and we can understand those different communication uses based on what we know about the anatomy of the typeface. So how do we understand type? Well, typography is comprised of 3 basic elements: letters, numbers, and punctuation points or marks. So let's go back to an earlier slide. So although there are 26 letters in the English language, there are more than 26 forms or letters in the font of a typeface. So the term typeface and font, this is where we're going to separate ourselves from the rest of humanity. We're going to learn the difference between a typeface and a font. Typeface is the term that we use to describe the entire body of letter forms within a type family. And the font is the individual letters within the typeface. Font is a French word that literally means cast in iron. So along in our history of type, it used to be physically produced in iron, and each letter was produced as a single form. And so that's where we get our term font. But often we confuse this. A lot of people use the word font and they refer to the entire body of type, but that is a typeface. So the typeface refers to all the letter forms, numbers, and elements inside the entire body. So within a typeface, there are different weights, and weights have a different stroke, often giving darker or lighter versions of that typeface. There are also different typeface families. So there are Roman, italic, there can be bold, light, condensed, extended, and all of these can exist within a particular typeface. So why is anatomy important? Well, this is how we start to understand the form and the function for the communication that we're trying to design. Each letter within a typeface has been beautifully and carefully designed, and the more we understand about the characteristics and anatomy of type, the more we'll be equipped to impactfully communicate. So I'm now going to go through some basics of the anatomy of letter forms. Let's start at the top left. So this is an ascender. It's a portion of the stem that goes above the media, or the X height. We'll talk about X height in a second. To the right is the descender, which is a portion of the stem that goes below the baseline. We'll talk about the baseline in a second. And a counter. A counter is the space in between. In the top left, we have the stroke. So this can be wider or narrower. In the middle, we have a serif. This looks like little feet. On the right, we have a sans serif. In the center, we look at stems and a cross stroke and a ligature. Now, this is letter forms that are connected. These terms make up the anatomy, and the anatomy is how we tell the difference between typefaces and how we can communicate. So let's look on the left top line, the crossbar. This is a connecting point between strokes in a letter. Then we have a terminal. This is the finishing of a letter form. Now these can look all different. And kerning is the space horizontally between each letter form. And all of this sits on a baseline. The baseline helps our eye to know. If you can imagine there was no baseline, it would be very difficult for our eye to follow any word because the letters would jump all over the place. So the baseline is really important. So leading is the space vertically between lines of type. The size of the type is determined from the top of a capital letter form to the bottom of the leading. And different typefaces have different designs for this, and the type size is measured in points or picas, and we'll get to that a little later in the term, but those are the terms used to measure type. So if you look at the bottom right of this image, the X height. X height is an extremely important term. So this goes from the baseline, so the line below the type, and to the top of a lowercase letter form. X height is really important in determining all types of communication elements. Other important terms include the stem, the neck, the bowl, and the axis. So the axis is kind of the way that a letter sits, and then it counters. There's an ear and a terminal, a descender and an ascender, which we talked about earlier, and all of these things help us to differentiate one typeface from another. So let's go back to the serif and the sans serif. A serif typeface has what looks like little feet, and a sans serif typeface has a straight edge. And these different typefaces are used to communicate in a different way. The ascender height, cap height, baseline, X height, median, and descender height are carefully designed elements within a typeface that help that typeface to communicate in a particular way. Understanding these terms will help you more effectively communicate with typography. Measuring type is also really important to communicating. Our existing measurements in type, again, reference back to the letterpress. Originally, type size had to do with the pieces of lead type in the letterpress, and similarly, the space between, which is called the leading, originally had to do with the strips of lead that were used to separate the lines. Tracking and kerning are terms that we use when talking about the spacing between the letters. So tracking is the removal of space between the letters, and kerning is the extension of space between the letters. Modern design programs allow us to set these types of elements within each typeface as we design. Here's an example of normal tracking, loose tracking, and tight tracking. So you can see how it changed the way that the letter forms look. Space is so important in understanding typography, in designing with type. Looking at the negative space, looking at the counters, looking at all the design elements of each letter form will help you be an effective communicator. It's important to remember that type is carefully designed, and as a designer, your understanding of the anatomy of typography will help you become an effective communicator.